wind out at Harper's Hollow had teeth, sharp ones. It didn't just whistle through the cracks in Evelyn Harper's cabin. It bit and gnawed and howled, a constant reminder of how thin the line was between shelter and the grave. For 5 long winters since her husband James was put in the ground, Evelyn had fought that wind. She'd patched the walls with burlap, stuffed the door frames with rags, and plugged every hole she could find with scrap wood and stubbornness. But the cold always found a way in. Tonight was worse. The snow wasn't just falling. It was a thick, white wall, burying the world in a heavy, smothering silence. The only sounds were the groan of old timbers fighting the weight of the storm and the low simmer of beans on the hearth. Evelyn sat in her rocking chair, the one she hadn't touched in years. Not since James. But tonight the silence inside was louder than the storm outside. That's when she heard it. A sound. Faint but sharp. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was something else. Something wrong. She set her tin cup of chicory on the floor, the creak of her chair screaming in the quiet. Her hand, steady and sure, reached for 2 things: the heavy lantern on the mantel and the cold, familiar stock of the Winchester rifle leaning by the door. Evelyn Harper wasn't a woman who spooked easily. You couldn't be. Not when your nearest neighbor was a 5-mile walk, and the world was full of men who'd take what you had just because they could. Out here, you learned to trust the feeling in your gut. And right now, her gut was screaming that something was terribly wrong in her barn. The barn stood 30 yards from the house, a crooked, dark shape against the chaos of swirling snow. It looked like a tomb. Evelyn pulled her shawl tight, the lantern light cutting a shaky golden path in front of her. The snow was up to her knees, icy water soaking the hem of her wool skirt. But she didn't slow. Every step was deliberate, her grip tight on the Winchester. She didn't believe in ghosts, but she'd seen the devil in men's eyes more than once. The barn door was open, just a crack. It swayed in the wind, tapping a soft, rhythmic beat against the frame. Tap, 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 like a countdown. She pressed her shoulder against the heavy wood, pushed it wider, and raised the lantern high, the rifle ready. The light flooded the dusty, hay-filled space, painting long, dancing shadows on the walls. And that's when she saw them. Slumped against the far wall was a man. His face was pale, his breathing ragged. One hand was pressed hard against his side, and even in the dim light, Evelyn could see the dark, wet stain of blood spreading across his coat. It was a lot of blood. His hat lay beside him, a fine felt hat now dusted with snow that had blown in through the open door. And next to him, a little girl. Couldn't be more than 9 years old. She was small and thin, wrapped in a threadbare shawl, clutching a shivering, half-starved pup to her chest like it was the last anchor in a storm. The girl wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. Her eyes, wide and dark, found Evelyn's and just watched, as if she'd seen this 100 times before. The man's voice was a low rasp, barely more than a whisper. "Ma'am," he coughed, emotion that sent a fresh wave of pain across his face. We ain't looking for trouble. Just needed a place out of the wind. We'll be gone by sunrise." Evelyn's finger rested on the trigger, the cold metal of familiar comfort. Her eyes scanned the man, the girl, the pup. They were drifters, that much was clear. But there was something else in the man's eyes. Not desperation, not fear. It was resolve. "Seems you ain't going anywhere soon with that side of yours leaking," she said, her voice flat, betraying nothing. She took a step closer, the lantern light catching the glint of something on the man's coat. It wasn't a button. The man's lips tugged into the ghost of a smile. "Reckon you're right about that." Evelyn looked down at the girl. Her cheeks were raw and red from the wind, but her chin was lifted. There was a defiance in that small face that tugged at something deep inside Evelyn, something she thought she'd buried with James. "What's your name, girl?" "Laya," she said, her voice small but clear. "And this is Bandit." She hugged the pup tighter. "And you?" Evelyn asked, her gaze returning to the man. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering from Evelyn to the rifle she held. "Matthew," he said finally. "Matthew Claiborne." Evelyn huffed. Names were cheap on the frontier. It was the stories behind them that carried weight. She scanned the barn again. The hay was thin, the air sharp. This storm wasn't just passing through. It was settling in for a long, cold stay. There was no way they'd survive the night out here. Not with that wound. "I got no spare rooms," she said, her voice hard as iron. "But the barn's got a roof, so long as you can keep from bleeding out on my floorboards." Matthew gave a slow, careful nod. "Much obliged, ma'am." Evelyn didn't offer anything more. She turned, her boots crunching in the snow, and walked back to the house. But her steps were slower now. Her mind wasn't just turning, it was spinning. Because the glint she'd seen on Matthew Claiborne's coat wasn't a button or a buckle. It was a lawman's badge, half hidden beneath his lapel, tarnished and caked with mud. What in God's name was a lawman doing bleeding out in her barn, miles from any town, pretending to be a simple drifter? The secret of the badge burned in Evelyn's mind. She stood in her kitchen, the warmth of the hearth doing nothing to chase the chill that had settled deep in her bones. A lawman. Why lie? Why hide the one thing that might have earned him help instead of the barrel of a gun? She ladled 2 bowls of the hot bean stew, the smell rich and smoky. She wrapped a small loaf of bread in a kitchen towel and lit a second, older lantern. This time, when she went to the door, she left the Winchester leaning against the frame. If he was a lawman, he was either the best liar she'd ever met, or he was in a kind of trouble that a rifle couldn't fix. Maybe both. When she returned to the barn, the scene was the same. The man, Matthew, hadn't moved, his breathing still shallow. But the girl, Leah, was on her feet now, standing between him and the door, a tiny, fierce guardian, her eyes locked on Evelyn, tracking her every move. Evelyn placed the food and the lantern on an overturned crate without a word. She didn't look at the badge again. She didn't want him to know she'd seen it. Knowledge was power out here, and ignorance was a shield. She turned to leave, but Matthew's voice, a little stronger now, stopped her. "Ma'am," he said. She paused at the door, her back to him. There's folks who might come looking." "What kind of folks?" she asked, her voice deliberately flat. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the howl of the wind. "The kind you don't want to find you," he finally answered. The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. Evelyn walked back to the house, the snow swirling around her, feeling like she'd just invited the devil himself to shelter on her land. From her kitchen window, she watched the faint glow of the second lantern inside the barn. She saw the small silhouette of Leah sitting close to her father, sharing the bread with the pup, her little frame curled against his side. Matthew leaned back, exhaustion carved into every line of his face, but his hand never left his daughter's shoulder. A familiar ache tightened in Evelyn's chest. It was the same way James used to hold her, a silent promise of protection against a world that was always trying to break you. She pulled the curtain shut, but the image was seared into her mind. Sleep wouldn't come. She spent the night in the rocking chair, the Winchester across her lap, listening for the sound of hoofbeats, for footsteps, for anything beyond the scream of the storm. Nothing came. When dawn finally broke, painting the snow-covered world in shades of soft gray and pale blue, Evelyn was already at the stove. She spooned hot cornmeal mush into a bowl, adding a generous knob of butter that melted into a golden pool. She covered it with a plate, wrapped the whole thing in a clean feed sack, and stepped back out into the biting cold. The snow had stopped, but the wind was still sharp. She left the breakfast on the same crate outside the barn door, tapped twice on the wood, and turned back to the house before anyone could see her. She wasn't being kind. She was being careful. That evening when she went to collect the bowl, it was empty and clean, and in its place was a small, crudely carved bird, whittled from a piece of scrap wood. It wasn't perfect, but the detail was careful, deliberate. It was a thank you, a silent conversation. But resting beside the bird was something else, a single, spent bullet casing. It was placed carefully, almost like a warning, or a message. Evelyn picked it up. It wasn't from a pistol or a standard rifle. It was heavy, thick, a buffalo gun maybe, the kind of weapon used for long distances, the kind of weapon a sniper would use. Someone hadn't just ambushed Matthew Claiborne, they had tried to execute him, and the casing left on her doorstep felt like a promise. They were going to try again. The spent casing felt cold and heavy in Evelyn's palm, a piece of a story she didn't want to be a part of. A sniper. That changed everything. This wasn't some back alley brawl or a robbery gone wrong. This was a hunt. And her farm, her hollow, was now the hunting ground. For the next 2 days, an uneasy truce settled over the property. Evelyn would leave food on the crate. Stew, bread, whatever she had. Each time the dishes would be returned, clean, sometimes with another small carving from Matthew or a bundle of neatly arranged kindling from Leah. They never spoke. It was a language of gestures, of shared space, but separate worlds. Leah, however, began to slowly, cautiously, bridge that gap. She started appearing near the chicken coop at dawn, a silent, watchful shadow. She'd scatter feed for the hens, her movements small and precise. One morning, Evelyn watched from the window as the girl pulled stubborn burrs from the old mule's tail, whispering secrets into its floppy ear. Matthew remained a ghost. Evelyn never saw him do the work, but the signs of him were everywhere. A fence post that had been leaning for a year was suddenly straight and solid. The stubborn hand pump by the well, which always took 3 tries to prime, now worked with a single, smooth pull. He was a phantom handyman, mending the broken pieces of her farm without ever crossing the invisible line she had drawn at her porch steps. His work unsettled her. It wasn't a debt being repaid. It felt like he was setting down roots, reinforcing the very place he claimed he was going to leave. A man on the run doesn't stop to fix a broken gate, unless he's not running, unless he's preparing for a siege. The town of Ironwood, however, was not a place for secrets. By the 3rd day, the whispers had already started to travel, carried on the wind like bitter seeds. "The Harper widow's taken in a drifter," Sadie Lou from the Mercantile said, her voice dripping with syrupy poison as Evelyn examined a sack of oats. "Saw a man's boots outside her barn. Weren't no ranch hands pair, I can tell you that." "Heard he's got a kid with him," another woman chimed in. "Mark my words, he's one of them desperados laying low." You know how Evelyn's always been different. Evelyn didn't move. She didn't look up, but her knuckles went white as she gripped the rough burlap of the sack. On her way out, Mr. Kramer, the store owner, gave her a hesitant nod, his eyes full of pity and fear, as if her trouble was a disease he might catch. She said nothing, loaded her buckboard and headed home, her jaw set in a hard, thin line. That evening, just as the sun began to bleed across the horizon, a rider appeared at the edge of her property. He rode slow and deliberate, a familiar silhouette against the fading light. Sheriff Amos Hart. He'd been wearing the same dusty coat since before James died, his face a roadmap of sun and suspicion. He was a man burdened by duty. "Evening, Evie," he said, tipping his hat as he dismounted. "Sheriff." She didn't offer him a seat on the porch. He hitched his horse to the post, his eyes scanning the barn, the house, everything. "Town's been restless," he said, his voice low. "Folks see a stranger out here. They start wondering." "Folks should mind their own fences," Evelyn replied, her tone as sharp as barbed wire. Amos sighed, shifting his weight. "Evie, I ain't here to cause you grief, but there's complications. A man went missing a few days back. Important man. The governor's pick for our new mayor." He paused, letting the words sink in. Lot of powerful men in this county wanted the old mayor, Crowley, to stay right where he was. They don't take kindly to outsiders sent to change things. Evelyn's blood ran cold. The badge, the sniper, the name, Matthew Claiborne. It wasn't just a name, it was a title. "And you think I'm harboring a politician?" she asked, forcing the words out. The sheriff's eyes were grim. "I think you're harboring a man with a target on his back the size of this county. And Crowley's boys, they don't just shoot to wound." He looked her straight in the eye. "Whoever you've got in that barn, he's not the first man to come to Ironwood looking to clean things up. The last one was your husband, James." The world tilted. James? Her James? The sheriff saw the shock on her face, and his expression softened. "His death wasn't no misunderstanding, Evie. James had been writing letters to the governor for months. He had proof of Crowley's land theft. He was trying to bring law to this town." He tipped his hat again. "Just be careful. This town doesn't forgive saints or sinners. And right now, I don't know which one you're hiding. As his silhouette faded into the dusk, Evelyn felt like the ground had fallen out from under her. Her husband hadn't been the victim of a random act of violence. He had been silenced. Shaking, she walked to her mailbox by the road. Tucked inside was a letter. It hadn't been there an hour ago. The handwriting was sharp and neat. It was sealed with a blob of red wax, stamped with an intricate seal, a wolf's head, Crowley's seal. But the letter wasn't addressed to her. It was addressed plainly to Mayor Matthew Claiborne, C.O. Harper's Hollow. They knew. They knew exactly where he was, and they knew she was helping him. This letter wasn't a message. It was a death sentence, and they had just signed her name right next to his. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the envelope, the sharp corners digging into her palm. Crowley's seal, a snarling wolf, seemed to mock her. They weren't just watching, they were playing a game, and her home was the board. She didn't take the letter to the barn. She didn't dare open it. To open it was to accept her role in their twisted play. Instead, she slid it between two heavy sacks of flour in the pantry, a secret buried in the heart of her home. Out of sight, but not out of mind. The fire in the hearth had burned low, but a different kind of fire was now blazing inside her. James. All these years she had believed the town's lie, a misunderstanding, a tragedy. But it was an execution, just like the one they'd attempted on Matthew. Her husband had died fighting the same monster that was now bleeding in her barn. This was no longer about a drifter and his daughter. This was about James. This was about justice. But the wound in Matthew's side was a ticking clock. The next morning she saw him stumble as he tried to secure a loose board on the chicken coop. His face, usually pale, was now tinged with a sickly gray. The infection was winning. Pride was a luxury, but death was a certainty. "You'll bleed yourself dead in that barn," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. She walked right up to him, hooking an arm under his before he could protest. He was surprisingly light, his body trembling with fever. He didn't fight her. He leaned on her, his breath coming in ragged hitches. She half dragged, half carried him into the house, into the warmth, into the light. She steered him toward the hearth and eased him down onto the old settee James had built. His jaw was clenched, his eyes squeezed shut against the pain, but he didn't make a sound. "You're stubborn," she grunted, fetching a basin of hot water and clean cloths. "So I've been told," he rasped, his eyes fluttering open. They were glassy with fever, but they were fixed on her. She carefully peeled back his blood-soaked shirt. The wound was angry, red and swollen, the edges inflamed. The bullet had only grazed him, a deep, nasty tear along his ribs. But days of cold and dirt had let the poison in. She began to clean it, her hands firm but gentle. He flinched, but that was all. As she worked, he started to talk, his voice thin and reedy, the words spilling out as the fever broke down his walls. "Governor sent me," he whispered, his eyes staring at the ceiling. "Said Ironwood was rotten to the core. Crowley, he's not just a thief, he's a king on a stolen throne. Land deeds forged, taxes that vanish. Men who disagree, they vanish too." He coughed, a dry, rattling sound. "My orders were to do it quiet. Find the real deeds, find the ledgers, replace him before he knew what was happening." "Quiet reform doesn't work on men like Crowley," Evelyn said, her voice low. She dabbed the wound with vinegar, and he hissed, his whole body going rigid. "No," he agreed, relaxing slightly as the sting faded. "It doesn't. They were waiting for me. Knew my name, knew my face. The ambush was professional. They didn't want to talk." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the small whittled bird now sitting on Evelyn's mantle. "I should have kept going. Should have taken Leah somewhere safe." "Why didn't you?" His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw past the pain and the fever to the man underneath, a man utterly exhausted. "Your light," he said. "In the storm. It was the first light we'd seen in 2 days. Leah," she smiled. "First time in weeks. I couldn't take her back out into the dark." The simple, devastating honesty of it hit Evelyn like a physical blow. Just then, small footsteps padded into the room. Leah stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her small face a mask of worry that was far too old for her years. "You all right, Papa?" she asked. I will be, Bug, Matthew said, managing a weak grin. The name he called her, Bug. It was so normal, so tender. It cracked another piece of the ice around Evelyn's heart. Lia, Evelyn said, her voice softer than she'd intended. Go fetch that jar of salve from the kitchen shelf and the roll of clean bandages. Lia darted away, her small feet barely making a sound. She returned a moment later with the salve, the bandages, and a small, faded photograph in a cracked leather frame. She held it out to Evelyn. It was a picture of a smiling young woman with kind eyes holding a baby. That's my mama, Lia said quietly. Her name was Maggie. Papa says she's a star now. He talks to her sometimes, when he thinks I'm asleep. Matthew's eyes were closed, but a single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. The fever, the pain, the confession, it had all drained him. As Evelyn gently applied the salve and wrapped his ribs with clean linen, she studied the photo. Maggie, pretty woman. And then she saw it. Around Maggie's neck was a silver locket. It was unusual, shaped like a key. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She'd seen that key before. After James died, when she was packing his things, she'd found one just like it. A small, ornate silver key that didn't fit any lock in the house. She had assumed it was just a keepsake and had put it away in her jewelry box. A forgotten piece of a man she was realizing she never truly knew. What was the connection between her dead husband, the new mayor's dead wife, and a key that opened nothing? The mystery of the key gnawed at Evelyn. It was a thread, a link between her past and her present, between James's fight and Matthew's. She waited until Matthew was asleep, his breathing finally deep and even under the influence of a willow bark tea she'd brewed for the fever. Lia was curled in a small chair by his side, a silent, unmoving sentry. Evelyn went to her bedroom. The small wooden jewelry box sat on her dresser, coated in a thin layer of dust. She hadn't opened it in years. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the lid. There, nestled amongst a few plain silver earrings and her mother's locket, was the key. It was identical to the one in the photograph of Matthew's wife. Silver, ornate, shaped like no ordinary key. Holding it in her palm, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. James had been a simple man, a rancher. He wasn't one for secrets or fancy trinkets. Why did he have this? And why did Maggie Claiborne, a woman hundreds of miles away, have its twin? Her mind raced back to the sheriff's words. James had been writing letters to the governor. He had been investigating Crowley. He must have uncovered something that required a key. She began to search. She started in the bedroom, then moved to the main room, her hands running over every floorboard, checking every nook and cranny. Nothing. She went to James's old workshop, a small shed attached to the barn. The air inside was thick with the scent of sawdust and old iron. Tools hung neatly on the walls just as he had left them. Everything was in its place. Too perfect. She ran her hand along the bottom of his heavy wooden workbench. Her fingers brushed against a small, almost invisible notch in the wood. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Using the tip of a knife, she pried at it. A small, hidden compartment swung open on a tiny hinge. Inside was a worn leather-bound journal. She took it back to the house, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the pages. She sat at the kitchen table, the lantern casting a pool of golden light, and began to read. It was James's handwriting. At first it was just ranch notes, cattle counts, feed prices, weather observations. But then the entries changed. They became guarded, cryptic. He wrote about the Wolf of Ironwood, Crowley. He documented conversations he'd overheard, land deals that seemed too good to be true, families who were run off their property after suddenly falling into debt with Crowley's bank. Then she found the entry that made her stop breathing. October 12th. Met with M today. She is brave, braver than any of us. She has the other half. The key is our only hope. If something happens to me, the map is in the heart of the hollow. M. Maggie? It had to be. James and Maggie Claiborne were working together. They were the original investigators. Matthew wasn't the start of this fight. He was the second wave. His wife had been in this from the beginning. Maybe she was the reason he was sent here. The journal was filled with coded notes and diagrams, but the last page was different. It was a hand-drawn map, a map of her own property, Harper's Hollow. There was a crude drawing of the house, the barn, the creek, and there was an X marked near a cluster of old gnarled oak trees at the northern edge of her pasture. Beside the X, James had drawn a symbol. It was the wolf's head, Crowley's seal. The map wasn't just in the heart of the hollow. Harper's Hollow was the heart. Whatever secret James and Maggie had died to protect, it was buried right here, on her land. That night the air felt wrong. The farm dogs, usually calm, paced restlessly by the porch, their hackles raised, letting out low, guttural growls at the darkness. Evelyn stood by the window, the journal clutched in her hand, the Winchester in the other. They were out there. She could feel it. The attack, when it came, wasn't subtle. It was a declaration of war. A flaming torch arced through the night sky, landing on the dry roof of the barn with a soft whoosh. Flames erupted, orange and yellow tongues licking at the old weathered shingles, eating through the wood with terrifying speed. "Liah!" Matthew's voice, raw and panicked, yelled from inside. Evelyn was already moving. She threw open the door, screaming, "Get out! Get out of the barn!" Matthew stumbled out, half carrying a terrified Liah, the pup yelping in her arms. He was still weak, but adrenaline gave him strength. The fire was spreading, the heat intense, the roar of the flames drowning out the sound of the wind. But they weren't alone. 3 figures on horseback emerged from the darkness, their faces hidden by the shadows of their wide-brimmed hats. They weren't there to watch it burn. They were raising their rifles. Suddenly a shot rang out, but it didn't come from the riders. It came from the house. Evelyn, dropping to one knee on the porch, had fired the Winchester. The bullet splintered the top rail of the fence near one of the riders, a clear, deadly warning. The men hesitated, surprised. They had expected a terrified widow, not a fight. Matthew pushed Leah behind him, his hand instinctively going to his hip for a gun that wasn't there. His eyes were wide with a desperate, helpless fury. "Get back in the house!" he yelled at Evelyn. But Evelyn didn't move. She levered another round into the chamber, the sound a sharp metallic click in the night. "This is my land," she shouted, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "You are not welcome here." 2 more torches flew through the air, landing near the porch. The dry wood of the steps began to smolder. They were trying to trap them, to burn the house down with them inside. Just as one of the riders aimed his rifle directly at Evelyn, a second shot cracked through the air. But this one was different, sharper, faster. The rider grunted, his rifle clattering to the ground as he clutched his shoulder, a dark stain spreading on his sleeve. The shot hadn't come from Evelyn. It had come from Matthew. He was now standing beside her on the porch, a small, concealable pistol in his hand, one he must have had hidden in his boot. His stance was perfect, his grip steady, his aim true. He moved with the deadly efficiency of a man who had spent more time with a gun in his hand than a pen. This was not the movement of a politician or a bureaucrat. This was the movement of a gunslinger. The remaining 2 riders, seeing their friend hit and facing 2 armed defenders, exchanged a nervous glance. This wasn't the easy job they'd been promised. With a curse, they wheeled their horses around, grabbed the reins of the injured man's horse, and galloped back into the darkness from which they came. The immediate threat was gone, but the barn was now an inferno. "The well!" Matthew yelled, already grabbing buckets from the porch. For the next hour they fought the fire, a desperate, choking battle. They worked in a frantic, unspoken rhythm, hauling bucket after bucket of icy water, throwing it against the ravenous flames. The fire fought back, spitting embers and thick black smoke. By the time it was over, half the barn roof was gone, the wall charred and blackened. The fire was out, but the message was clear. Crowley wasn't just sending warnings anymore. He was trying to erase them. They stood in the snow, breathless and covered in soot, watching smoke curl up into the star-filled sky. The cold air burned their lungs. "You can shoot," Evelyn said, breaking the silence. It wasn't a question. Matthew looked at the pistol in his hand as if seeing it for the first time. "I've had some practice," he said, his voice grim. That wasn't practice, Evelyn countered, her eyes boring into his. That was instinct. Who are you, Matthew? Who are you, really? He finally met her gaze, the firelight reflecting in his tired eyes. I'm the man the governor sent, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. It was a half-truth, and they both knew it. My husband, James, was investigating Crowley before he died, Evelyn said, her voice shaking with a mixture of grief and rage. He was working with your wife, Maggie. I found his journal. I found the key. Matthew's face went slack with shock. All the walls he had so carefully built came crumbling down in an instant. Her key. You have Maggie's key? He whispered, his voice cracking. I have my husband's key, she corrected him, and his map. A map to something on this property. Something they died to protect. I think it's time you told me the whole truth. He sank onto the porch steps, the pistol resting on his knee, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The truth, he said heavily, is that Matthew Claiborne is already dead. The confession hung in the cold, smoky air like a ghost. Matthew Claiborne was dead. The man sitting on her porch, the man who had fixed her fence and fought beside her, was an imposter. He died on the road to Ironwood, the man said, his voice hollow. Crowley's men ambushed him, the same men who came for me. I was his deputy, John Rourke. He looked up at her, his face etched with exhaustion and grief. I found him just before he was my friend, Evelyn. He made me promise. Promise I'd protect Laya. Promise I'd finish what he and Maggie and your husband started. Laya, she wasn't his daughter. She was the orphaned child of the real Matthew Claiborne. John Rourke had taken on a dead man's name and a dead man's mission, all to keep a promise. Laya doesn't know, he said quickly, his voice pleading. She was there. She saw it happen. The shock. It's kinder for her to believe I'm her father. It's the only thing that's kept her going. Evelyn's mind reeled. The lies, the half-truths. It all made sense now. He wasn't a politician playing cowboy. He was a lawman, a deputy, forced into a role he wasn't prepared for, burdened by a promise he couldn't break. The journal, he said, his focus sharpening. And the key. What did you find? Evelyn didn't hesitate. She went inside and returned with James's journal and the small silver key. She opened it to the last page, to the map of her land. John, she would have to get used to calling him that, took the journal, his hands tracing the lines his dead friend's wife must have helped draw. The heart of the hollow, he murmured, reading James's words aloud. He looked from the map to the key in Evelyn's palm. Maggie told me about the keys. They were a safety measure. She and your husband split the evidence they'd collected. Each of them hid their half in a secure location. You needed both keys, turned at the same time, to open the boxes. A dead man's switch. If one of them was killed, the other could still expose Crowley, but neither could be forced to give up the whole thing. So there are two boxes, Evelyn breathed. Yes, Maggie's is hidden somewhere in Ironwood, but James's, it's here, on your land. He stood up, his eyes scanning the dark pasture toward the northern edge of the property. That's why Crowley is so desperate. He couldn't find the evidence on Claiborne's body. He doesn't know where it is, but he knows it's close. He's not just trying to kill us. He's trying to find that box. The ground beneath her feet suddenly felt both sacred and dangerous. Her land wasn't just a home. It was a tomb, a bank vault, a battleground. We have to get to it, she said, her voice firm, before he does. They couldn't wait for dawn. Crowley's men would be back, and they'd be back in force. They left Leia sleeping inside, barricaded in the house with the pup, Bandit, standing guard by her side. Armed with lanterns, shovels, the Winchester, and John's pistol, they headed out into the oppressive darkness of the north pasture. The air was frigid. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind in the bare branches of the trees sounded like an approaching enemy. They found the cluster of old oaks from James's map, their twisted shapes like ancient sentinels guarding a secret. The X on the map was at the base of the largest tree, its roots thick and gnarled, breaking through the frozen earth. They began to dig. The ground was hard, resistant, fighting them for every inch. For what felt like hours, the only sounds were the scrape of shovels against rock and their own ragged breaths misting in the lantern light. Finally, Evelyn's shovel hit something that wasn't rock, a dull, metallic thud. Their hearts pounded as they cleared the remaining dirt. It was a metal box, about the size of a small chest, rusted and heavy. On the lid were two keyholes, side by side. But as the light from John's lantern fell upon it, they saw something else. Carved into the metal lid, right above the locks, was the snarling wolf's head of Crowley's seal. "James must have put this here," Evelyn whispered, "as a final insult." But John was shaking his head, a look of dawning horror on his face. "No," he said, his voice tight. "This isn't an insult. It's a trap." Before Evelyn could ask what he meant, a voice cut through the darkness, smooth and cold as a snake's belly. "I do appreciate you doing all the heavy lifting." They spun around. Benjamin Crowley stepped out from behind a tree, a smug, triumphant smirk on his face. He wasn't alone. He had at least a dozen men with him, all armed, materializing from the shadows like specters. They were surrounded, and standing next to Crowley, holding a lantern high, was Sheriff Amos Hart. The sheriff's face was unreadable, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Amos?" Evelyn's voice was a choked whisper of betrayal. "How could you?" The sheriff didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the box. "Some things are more complicated than they seem, Evie," he said, his voice flat. "Not this," Crowley chuckled, stepping forward. "This is quite simple. That box contains certain business records. Records I mean to have back, along with the key you're holding." He gestured to Evelyn. "Hand it over, both of you, and I might just let the girl live." John raised his pistol, but half a dozen rifles were instantly leveled at his chest. He was a good shot, but he wasn't that good. They were caught. "What's in the box, Crowley?" John demanded, stalling for time. Crowley's smirk widened. "The future of Ironwood, a future that doesn't include interfering governors or their meddling deputies." He looked at the box, a greedy light in his eyes. "And the original deed to this very hollow. It seems your husband wasn't just investigating me, Mrs. Harper. He was trying to buy back land that was never truly his." It was another lie, another twist of the knife designed to break her. But Evelyn didn't flinch. She looked past Crowley, past the armed thugs, and straight at Sheriff Hart. His eyes finally met hers, and in them she didn't see betrayal. She saw conflict. He was a man trapped, just as they were. "The other key," John said suddenly, his eyes darting around. "You only have one half of the puzzle, Crowley." "Oh, I have the other key," Crowley said with a dismissive wave. "Took it off the real Mayor Claiborne's body myself. Now give me yours, or we start this party early." John knew it was a bluff. If Crowley had the other key, he would have dug up the box himself weeks ago. He was trying to force their hand. They had seconds to make a choice, and that's when Sheriff Hart moved. It wasn't fast. It wasn't dramatic. He simply took 2 steps to the side, away from Crowley, and as he moved, he drew his pistol. But he didn't aim it at John or Evelyn. He aimed it squarely at 2 of Crowley's men. "I believe the deputy is right," the sheriff said, his voice ringing with authority. "You're bluffing, Ben, and your little party is over." For a heart-stopping moment, nobody moved. The pasture was a frozen tableau of guns, lanterns, and hatred. Crowley's face contorted from smug triumph to pure, undiluted rage. "You damn fool, Hart! You just signed your own death warrant." "Maybe," Amos replied, his voice steady, "but I'll be damned if I let you burn this county to the ground." That's when all hell broke loose. The night exploded in a chaotic symphony of gunfire. Crowley's men, recovering from their shock, opened fire. John and Evelyn dove behind the large oak tree as bullets splintered the bark around them. Sheriff Hart returned fire, his shots precise and deadly, taking down one of Crowley's men before a bullet caught him in the leg, sending him to the ground with a grunt of pain. "The key!" John yelled over the roar of the guns. "The trap! What did you mean?" "The seal!" Evelyn shouted back, her mind working frantically. "It's not just a carving, it's a mechanism. James was a blacksmith before he was a rancher. He was clever with things like this." She risked a glance at the box. The wolf's head seal was in the center of the lid. It had two small, almost invisible holes where the wolf's eyes should be. Keyholes. The two locks on the front of the box were decoys. The real lock was the seal itself, and it required two keys inserted at the same time. It wasn't a dead man's switch. It was a partnership. One person couldn't open it alone. "We need both keys," she screamed. But where was the other one? Crowley had lied about taking it from Claiborne's body. So where was it? As John laid down covering fire, picking off another one of Crowley's thugs, Evelyn's gaze fell on the injured sheriff. He was trying to reload, his face pale with pain, and around his neck, tucked under his shirt, was a silver chain, a chain she had never seen before. Crawling on her belly, dirt and snow grinding into her clothes, Evelyn scrambled towards him. Bullets whizzed over her head, thudding into the frozen earth. "Amos!" she yelled. "The key! Do you have it?" He looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, weary regret. "James gave it to me," he gasped, pulling the chain from under his shirt. "Told me to keep it safe. Told me to wait for the right person to show up with the other half." Dangling from the chain was the second silver key. He'd had it all along. He hadn't been Crowley's man. He had been James's. He'd been protecting the secret, waiting, watching. "I couldn't act alone, Evie," he said, pressing the key into her hand. Had to be sure. Had to wait for them to overplay their hand. "They're not done playing," she said, pocketing the key. Crowley, seeing his men falling and his plan unraveling, let out a roar of frustration. "Forget them! Get the box!" he screamed at his remaining men. Two of them broke from cover, charging toward the hole where the chest lay. John took one of them down, but the other was too close. He reached the box, his hands grabbing for the handles. But then a new sound joined the fray, a high-pitched, ferocious barking. Out of the darkness, a small furry missile launched itself at the man, sinking its teeth into his leg. Bandit. The pup, small but fierce, had somehow gotten out of the house and followed them. The man cried out in pain and surprise, kicking the dog away. But the distraction was all John needed. A single shot, and the man fell. Crowley was in a frenzy. He had lost control. He drew his own pistol and charged forward, firing wildly at John and Evelyn. They took cover again, but he was getting closer to the box. That's when another sound echoed across the hollow, a sound that made everyone freeze. It was the ringing of the old iron bell on Evelyn's porch. The bell she only rang in case of dire emergency. It was being rung over and over, a frantic, desperate alarm call. "Liah!" The sound seemed to break a spell. Down the long road leading to Harper's Hollow, new lights appeared. Lanterns, dozens of them, bobbing in the darkness. The people of Ironwood, they were coming. Harlan from the feed store, Mr. Kramer from the mercantile, Sarah Bell and her sons. They weren't a militia, just simple townsfolk armed with hunting rifles, shotguns, and a deep-seated anger at the man who had ruled their lives through fear. Liah hadn't just rung a bell. She had called an army. Seeing the approaching lights, Crowley's remaining men lost their nerve. They weren't paid enough to fight an entire town. They began to fall back, melting into the woods. Crowley was alone. He stood over the box, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, a cornered animal ready for one last desperate act. He looked from the approaching townsfolk to John and Evelyn. He knew he was beaten, but he wasn't going to leave empty-handed. With a snarl, he abandoned the box and sprinted back toward the house. "If I can't have the proof," he screamed, his voice cracking with madness, "I'll take the witness." He was going for Leah. The race back to the house was a blur of pounding feet and desperate, ragged breaths. John, his long legs eating up the ground, was in the lead. But Crowley had a head start. Evelyn was right behind, the Winchester feeling impossibly heavy in her tired arms. Crowley burst through the front door of the cabin just as John reached the porch. A moment later, a gunshot echoed from inside. Evelyn's heart stopped. A cold, absolute dread washed over her. She stumbled up the steps, raising her rifle, expecting the worst. She saw Crowley first. He was on the floor, a look of utter shock on his face, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He wasn't dead, but he was down. Standing over him, her small body trembling, but her eyes blazing with a fire Evelyn had never seen before, was Liah. In her hands she held John's small pistol. the one he'd left on the settee. The barrel was still smoking. Behind her, huddled by the hearth, was Bandit, growling low in his throat. John rushed to Laya, gently taking the gun from her shaking hands. "Are you okay, Bug?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. She just nodded, tears finally starting to stream down her dirt-streaked face, and collapsed into his arms. Evelyn kept her rifle trained on Crowley. He was trying to speak, blood bubbling on his lips. "The deed," he gurgled. "The hollow?" "It's not yours," Evelyn said, her voice cold as the grave. "It never was." Just then, the townsfolk, led by a limping Sheriff Hart, crowded onto the porch and into the doorway. They stood in silence, taking in the scene. The bleeding tyrant on the floor, the lawman holding the crying child, and the widow standing guard over her home, her face hard as granite. The long night was over. In the aftermath, the truth, like the dawn, came slowly and then all at once. With Sheriff Hart's testimony and the evidence from the two keys, the story was laid bare. The box James had buried didn't just contain proof of Crowley's land fraud and extortion. It contained the original town charter and dozens of stolen deeds. Crowley hadn't just been bleeding Ironwood dry. He had been systematically trying to steal ownership of the entire county, piece by piece. Harper's Hollow was the last independent parcel of land he needed to control the water rights for the whole valley. The second box, Maggie Claiborne's box, was found hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the mayor's office, the very seat of Crowley's power. It contained the financial ledgers, detailing years of stolen taxes and payoffs, implicating half a dozen prominent men in the territory. The Wolf of Ironwood hadn't worked alone. Crowley didn't die on Evelyn's floor. He lived long enough to be hauled away by federal marshals, his reign of terror ending not with a bang, but with the clink of iron shackles. His remaining cronies were rounded up, their power evaporating overnight as the people they had once terrorized found their voices. Ironwood began to breathe again. John Rourke, the man who had worn a dead man's identity like a shield, became a hero. The governor, upon hearing the full story, officially appointed him as the interim marshal of Ironwood County, tasked with rebuilding the town's trust in the law. He didn't move into the mayor's house. He stayed at Harper's Hollow. The charred barn became a project. The townsfolk, the same ones who had whispered about the drifter in the widow's barn, showed up day after day with lumber, nails, and strong arms. They rebuilt it, bigger and stronger than before. It was no longer just Evelyn's barn. It was a symbol of their renewed community, a place where people came together to mend what was broken. Laya, the little girl who had seen too much, began to heal. She planted a small garden of marigolds by the porch steps, and their bright, stubborn color became a splash of hope against the harsh landscape. She still kept Bandit close, but her laughter, once a rare and precious sound, was now a common melody in the hollow. She called John Papa, and she started calling Evelyn Mama Evie. And Evelyn, to her own surprise, found that the name fit. One evening, months later, as the sun set and painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, the three of them sat on the newly repaired porch. The air was cool, but the silence was comfortable, peaceful. It was a silence filled not with loss, but with presence. "You ever think about leaving?" Evelyn asked quietly, looking at John. "Your promise is kept. You don't have to stay." John looked out at the land, at the new barn, at the lights of Ironwood twinkling in the distance. He then looked at Laya, who was asleep in Evelyn's lap, her head resting on a heart that had finally, after years of winter, thawed. "Everything I was looking for," he said, his voice low and steady, "I found right here." He reached out and laid his hand over hers. It wasn't a gesture of passion, but of something deeper. Partnership. Belonging. Evelyn had thought her life was over when she buried James. She had resigned herself to a life of quiet survival, of fighting the wind and the cold alone. But the storm had brought more than just snow. It had brought a broken man and a lost child, and with them, a fight she didn't know she was meant to join. They hadn't just found shelter in her barn, they had reignited the fire in her home. Home, she realized, wasn't just four walls and a plot of land. It was the people you chose to stand with when the world tried to burn you down. It was the hands that helped you rebuild from the ashes, The wind still blew through Harper's Hollow, but it didn't sound so lonely anymore. If you enjoyed this story of how a quiet hollow became the heart of a revolution and how ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they stand together, then you're in the right place. We believe the greatest legends of the West aren't always about famous outlaws and legendary gunfights. Sometimes they're about the quiet courage it takes to mend a fence, to shelter a stranger, and to fight for the soul of a town. There are more stories just like this one waiting to be told. So do us a favor, hit that like button, and if you haven't already, click subscribe and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Thanks for listening.